Perfect.
And sorry, I'm Hart Jansen, just to remind people. Thank you, and just before I get started, I want to welcome 5 Oakville councillors who are attending. We have Janet Haslett-Thiel from Ward 3 and Jonathan McNeese from Ward 1 here in person. And online we have Councillor Alan Elgar, Ward 5, I think, Ward 4, sorry. Kathy Deddick from Ward 2, and Dave Giddings, Janet's companion from Ward 3. So welcome councillors. Okay, we can proceed with the next slide. So I just want to, who here is from GASP? Hey, we have a good contingent. We have 7-8 people here from GASP. That's wonderful. And who here is from CFUW? Oh, it's like, it's a competition, almost equal. Thank you all. And how many people do we have here from Hasten besides myself? We have four of us. Linda's an honorary member. Okay. All right, so next slide. So I'm not going to go into any detail on the climate crisis, just an overview. Some of you may have the motivation this evening. You came here to find out, how do I save money with a heat pump? And there's nothing wrong with that. Others will be motivated by the opportunity to reduce their household carbon emissions by up to 90%. And I hope and expect that, again, most of you understand that we're truly in a crisis. We can see a dramatic increase in severe weather, floods, heat waves, drought, fires, and landslides, and that's just California. We've got massive hurricanes, cyclones, record-breaking tides, melting of glaciers, warming of Arctic regions by more than 5 degrees. So again, I think the evidence is quite obvious. But we're here to show you one important way in which we can all fix it. That's by replacing your gas furnace and or your your water heater with electric heat pumps. So I'm just going to give you some of the background on what, we want to reduce our use of natural gas. So how does that help the environment? I'm going to just go through some of the basics that's going to help you understand how important it is. Next slide. Right, so let's remember Canada is among the worst carbon emitters in the world. We're at about almost 3 times the emission of the G20 average. And let's also be aware that we now have definitive proof that fossil fuel combustion causes lung cancer, according to an article in Lancet, a study by the Sir Francis Crick Institute in the UK, as well as the increased heart attacks, strokes, and other lung disease that we knew about before. So not only do we have a responsibility to use our abundant resources to reduce our carbon emissions, but also a responsibility to our own community to reduce local air pollution that causes lung cancer and other diseases. Next slide. So in Halton, all the municipalities in Halton and the region itself declared climate emergencies almost 4 years ago. And when we look at the data about emissions, the exact percentages vary by municipality, and it depends on the data quality and the assumptions made. The figure here for buildings, it says 27% due to residential buildings, is according to the Oakville Energy Task Force. We have the Toronto Atmospheric Fund with a very recent report on 2021 emissions. They say that natural gas is responsible for 41% of all emissions in the Greater Toronto-Hamilton area. Let's just conclude that emissions caused by natural gas are substantial, and it's essential to reduce these emissions substantially to meet the municipal and federal emissions goals. And we now know that emissions from methane gas, also known as natural gas, are much higher than was previously thought. Okay, next one. So, again, just briefly, there's a number of greenhouse gases. The most important two are carbon dioxide. That's responsible for most of the climate change effects we see, and it persists in the atmosphere for 300 to 1,000 years. Whereas methane, again, also a carbon emission, persists only for 10 or 20 years, but it's 90 times as potent in terms of its greenhouse effect than carbon dioxide. So, which means we can rapidly reduce the effects of climate change if we can reduce the amount of methane released into the atmosphere. It's going to be a longer-term challenge with carbon dioxide. So when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions, or carbon emissions, or carbon, we're using them synonymously in this presentation, and it means the release of carbon dioxide and or methane. Next slide. So here's the emissions picture for natural gas use, which is going to be, again, a focus today, because heat pumps reduce that use of natural gas. So natural gas is about 95% methane. And when it's extracted, so if you look on the left side of the slide, you're extracting gas using some kind of well. 80% of the new wells in Canada are fracked wells, or they use a fracturing technique to extract the methane. And these have very significant leaks of methane in the extraction process. And there's also leaks, again, all going into the atmosphere when the gas is processed, and some of this gas is flared either when gas is extracted or when oil is extracted, and it creates significant leaks of methane, as well as in the distribution system. Again, you can see the pipeline going from the left-hand side on the bottom to the right-hand side, piping the methane into your residence. So we've got lots of emissions of that potent methane going into the atmosphere, even before the gas gets to your house. Now, when you burn that methane in your house, your water heater and your furnace, it creates primarily carbon dioxide and water. So that combustion process is relatively clean, but the overall emissions are not. Next slide. There we go. So don't let the word natural fool you. We are extracting, distributing, and burning methane. So the basic fact is that the average home emits, this is the average Ontario home, emits 5 tons of carbon dioxide emissions from the burning of the methane in the home. And this estimate is from the Environment Commissioner of Ontario in 2019. Next slide. So natural gas, then, it's cleaner burning when at the residence. You don't get the sulfur dioxide and nitrous oxide that you get from burning coal. But from a carbon emissions viewpoint, it's just as bad or worse than coal. And recent articles in Nature and National Geographic Science have synthesized the more accurate recent data, which properly accounts for methane's effects over 20 years rather than 100 years, as was done previously, and more accurately accounts for the upstream emissions that we discussed. And so these articles and these recent studies show that carbon emissions are quite intense. And you'll of course see that the gas extraction and distribution industries, and to a large degree government agencies, are quoting the older data because it's to their apparent advantage. So another myth busted. Natural gas creates as many carbon emissions as coal, and maybe even a bit more. There is no such thing as clean natural gas. It's a myth propagated by the gas industry and gas distributors, just as the false claim of clean diesel was propagated for years before it was disproven. And if there's interest later in the Q&A, we can talk about the myth of the attractiveness of gas stoves. Next slide. So reduction in methane emissions is the most effective way to combat the climate crisis over the next 10 to 20 years. Again, because methane is 90 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So the good news is we have control over the type of fuel we use and the type of appliances we use in our home. I've been able to reduce my carbon emissions by 90% using a heat pump and an electric water heater and an induction stove. Again, no gas line to my house. And I can talk about that a little more when we start the panel discussion. So climate scientists agree, based on the recent data, that the most effective means for society to reduce carbon emissions in the short to medium term is reduction of methane emissions. And many jurisdictions, as you see, are leading this trend by mandating the phase-out of gas-powered appliances. And most notably, New York State, our neighbor, has a recent plan to legislatively ban the installation of gas furnaces and water heaters as of next year. They understand the science and they're acting on it. So heat pumps have been in use for 50 years. The technology is proven and effective in cold climates such as ours. We have the knowledge, we have the tools. All we need is the individual will. That means you. Please consider installing a heat pump, and for greater impact, we also need the political will to mandate change. Next slide. So, if we eliminate the burning of the natural gas in our homes, then we eliminate the carbon dioxide emissions from our home, and more importantly, next slide, we eliminate all those upstream methane emissions. And if you can't eliminate natural gas use entirely in your home, then reduce it as much as possible. Every ton counts. Thank you.